The dam did not fail. That is what makes Vajont so terrifying. When people hear the phrase dam disaster, they imagine cracked concrete, collapsing walls, or a flood caused by engineering weakness. Vajont is worse than that, because on the night of October 9th, 1963, one of the tallest dams in the world remained standing while nearly everything below it was destroyed. The wall held, the valley died. That single fact already makes the story feel unnatural. A structure built to control water survived. The people who trusted the valley beneath it did not. Vajont Dam stood in northern Italy, in a narrow alpine gorge that looked almost designed for human ambition. Tall rock walls, deep valley, a place where engineers could trap enormous force inside elegant geometry. On paper, it was brilliant. A thin, arching concrete wall rising out of stone, modern, confident, almost beautiful in its severity. It was supposed to symbolize mastery, the kind of mastery only modern engineering could claim. Water would be stored, controlled, directed, turned into power. Nature would be measured, disciplined, and used. But the danger at Vajont was never only the dam. It was the mountain above the reservoir. Long before the final disaster, Montauk had already shown signs that it did not want to stay still. The slopes were geologically complex, layered, fractured, and vulnerable to movement. This was not a perfectly obedient wall of rock overlooking a reservoir. It was a body of unstable earth under pressure. As the water level in the reservoir changed, the mountain began to answer. Cracks appeared. The slope shifted. Smaller slides occurred. Instruments tracked movement. Engineers, geologists, and officials were not staring at a silent landscape. They were watching one that was already speaking. And still, the belief remained that the danger could be managed. That is where Vajont becomes more than a natural disaster. It becomes a story about human beings seeing warning signs, studying them, discussing them, and still staying inside the psychological comfort of control. The problem was not total ignorance, it was fatal confidence. The people in charge did not think nothing could happen. They thought they understood what would happen. They believed the mountain might slide, but in a way that could be predicted, slowed, or contained. They believed the reservoir level could be adjusted. They believed monitoring gave them enough time. They believed the scale of the threat still belonged inside calculation. That belief is the true horror in this story. Because once people start trusting a model more than the mountain itself, they stop reacting to danger as danger. It becomes a technical issue, a management problem, a variable, a chart, a sequence of readings. The slope moves a little more, and instead of terror, it produces meetings, more measurements, more interpretation, more confidence that the final outcome can still be shaped by procedure. And the mountain kept moving. In the years before the disaster, there were signs strong enough to unsettle anyone willing to feel unsettled. A major slide had already occurred in the reservoir area. The slope was not just theoretically unstable, it was physically active. Movement accelerated at times. Water levels were raised and lowered. The mountain responded. The entire relationship between reservoir and slope had become a kind of experiment no one should have wanted to continue. But the logic of modern projects is powerful. Too much money had been spent. Too much prestige had been attached. Too much confidence had already been declared. It is very hard for institutions to admit that the landscape itself has rejected the plan. So the valley kept moving toward night. And below all of this was Longarone. That is the part that makes Vajont unbearable. Because while experts watched readings and interpreted slope movement, a real town went on living beneath the geometry of risk. Longarone was not an abstract settlement downstream. It was homes, kitchens, bedrooms, children, elderly parents, routine, fatigue, supper plates, shutters, lamps and people trying to sleep before the next ordinary morning. That is what disaster always crushes first. Not statistics, but normality. On October 9th, 1963, the final hours did not announce themselves like the opening of a movie. There was no giant visible countdown in the sky, but the slope above the reservoir was moving faster. The signs had become more urgent, and still the essential belief held that the event, even if serious, would remain within some calculated boundary. At 10:39 p.m., that belief ended. A massive section of Montauk broke loose and plunged into the reservoir. It happened with almost incomprehensible speed, not a slow slump, not the gentle yielding of a hillside. A gigantic mass of rock, earth, and debris collapsed into the water with such violence that the reservoir became a weapon. The landslide forced the water upward in an instant. A towering wave rose inside the narrow basin, slammed against the sides, and then shot over the top of the dam. This is the second great shock of Vajont. The dam itself did not need to break for the valley to be annihilated. The water became the disaster by being displaced, compressed, and thrown forward at terrible speed. The wall remained. The wave climbed over it, and then it dropped into the valley below. Longarone did not face a normal flood. It faced a descending force of water, mud, debris, and impact in darkness, arriving with almost no meaningful time to react. Houses were crushed, streets vanished, entire families disappeared in minutes. Some people likely woke into confusion before they ever understood what they were hearing. Others never had that chance. The town was not simply flooded. It was erased. That image should never leave the story. People asleep in bed while a mountain collapses into a reservoir above them and turns stored water into a killing wall. This is where Vajont becomes almost impossible to process emotionally. If the dam had shattered, the human mind would at least place the blame into a familiar shape. Structure failed, water escaped, town destroyed. But Vajont denies even that comfort. The concrete stayed there. The great symbol of human control remained visible, while the lives below it were torn out of the valley. It is one of the cruelest visual contradictions in modern disaster history. A standing dam above a dead town. And that contradiction matters. Because Vajont was not only a tragedy of geology, it was a tragedy of interpretation. Engineers and decision-makers saw movement and believed they could stay ahead of it. They believed the mountain's behavior could still be translated into something manageable. They lowered the water level at times. They monitored. They calculated. They tried to create a scenario in which even a landslide would happen in a controlled way. But the critical error was not merely technical. It was philosophical. They kept treating the mountain as a problem that belonged inside their system, instead of recognizing that the system itself had already exceeded what the landscape would tolerate. That is the lesson that gives Vajont its lasting darkness. Most disasters frighten us because nature is powerful. Vajont frightens us because powerful institutions looked at growing evidence and still kept the catastrophe inside the language of confidence. The valley was already warning them. The slope was already moving. The signs were already there. But the desire to preserve control can be stronger than the willingness to surrender to reality. And once that happens, disaster becomes almost procedural. That is why Vajont still feels modern. Not because of the concrete alone, but because the pattern repeats everywhere human beings build too close to certainty. Warning signs become technical debates. Risk becomes management language. Alarms are softened by expertise. And ordinary people go on living beneath decisions they did not make, trusting that someone above has correctly understood the danger. Longarone paid for that trust. Visually, few disasters are as psychologically violent as this one. A steep alpine valley, a perfectly standing dam, a mountain with a piece torn out of it, and below, devastation. The landscape itself becomes evidence against human arrogance. The mountain says one thing, the concrete says another. The dead valley tells you which one was true. So when you hear the name Vajont Dam, do not picture only a famous engineering structure in Italy. Picture a mountain already giving warnings. Picture experts reading movement and believing they still had time. Picture a reservoir turned into a weapon by the very landscape it was supposed to tame. Picture families asleep in Longarone while a wave climbs over a dam that never even breaks. Because Vajont was not simply a flood, not simply a landslide, and not simply an engineering failure. It was a catastrophe born from the moment human confidence stayed alive longer than it should have. And if Vajont is terrifying because people believed they could contain the water, Lituya Bay is terrifying because no one could contain it at all. In Alaska, a landslide crashed into a narrow fjord and drove water so high that it stripped trees from the mountainside hundreds of meters above sea level. In the next video, we go there, to a place where water did not just flood the land, it climbed the mountain.